26th of February 1935, Daventry, Northamptonshire. A hulking BBC transmitter pushes radio waves into the grey English sky, whilst 3 miles away, a modified van sits parked on a quiet country road. Inside, Robert Watson Watt watches a cathode ray tube with the intensity of a man who knows he's running out of time. His colleague, Arnold Wilkins, adjusts the receiver as a Handley Page Hayford bomber drones overhead at precisely the arranged moment. The green line on the screen shivers, then jumps. A distinct blip appears, moves across the display, and fades as the aircraft passes beyond range. Watson Watt exhales. In that single moment, invisible radio waves have bounced off aluminium skin and returned to tell their story. The bomber has been seen without eyes, tracked without sound, detected through clouds and darkness by nothing more than the echo of electromagnetic radiation. Britain has just discovered it can see the invisible, and in doing so, has bought itself the margin between survival and annihilation. The problem facing Britain in the mid-1930s was not merely military, but existential. The bomber, as Stanley Baldwin grimly observed, would always get through. European cities lay vulnerable beneath open skies, and the Channel, that ancient moat which had protected the realm for centuries, meant nothing to aircraft. The Great War had introduced aerial bombing, and the Spanish Civil War was demonstrating its terrible potential with nauseating clarity. Guernica burned in 1937, whilst politicians calculated how many tons of high explosive might fall on London in the first days of any future conflict. Conservative estimates suggested 100,000 casualties in the opening fortnight. The arithmetic was simple and horrifying. Bombers could reach London in under an hour from German airfields, and Britain possessed no reliable means of detecting them before they arrived. Sound locators, concrete acoustic mirrors built along the coast, could detect engine noise at perhaps 20 miles on a calm day, but only if the wind cooperated and the aircraft flew low. Visual observation depended on clear weather and daylight. Britain's defensive calculations rested on optimistic assumptions about visibility and the hope that observers might spot incoming raids with sufficient warning to scramble fighters. It wasn't enough. The Air Ministry knew it wasn't enough. Without early warning, the RAF would be reduced to standing patrols that burned fuel, exhausted pilots, and still left vast stretches of sky unwatched. Britain needed to see further, see earlier, see in darkness and fog and rain. It needed something that didn't yet exist. The solution emerged not from military laboratories, but from the radio research station at Slough, where Watson Watt had been investigating thunderstorms. When the Air Ministry inquired whether radio waves might be weaponized as a death ray, Watson Watt's calculations suggested the idea was nonsense, but his assistant Wilkins noted that aircraft might reflect radio energy. The resulting memorandum, dated February 12, 1935, proposed using radio pulses to detect aircraft at distance. 2 weeks later came the Daventry experiment. What followed was the most frantically productive development programme in British scientific history. By June 1935, a dedicated transmitter at Orfordness detected aircraft at 17 miles. By September, it reached 40 miles. The principle was elegantly simple. Transmit a pulse of radio energy, wait for the echo, measure the time delay. Radio waves travel at the speed of light, 299,792 kilometers per second. So a 6 microsecond delay meant the reflecting object sat roughly 1 kilometer away. Double the time for the return journey, and basic arithmetic revealed range. The technical execution was anything but simple. Early transmitters required enormous aerial arrays. The first operational chain home stations used 110-metre steel towers supporting curtains of copper wire that transmitted on wavelengths between 10 and 13 metres. The receiver aerials stood on separate 73-metre wooden towers positioned to minimize interference. Each pulse lasted 20 microseconds, transmitted at a frequency of around 25 MHz, with a power output of roughly 350 kilowatts. The cathode ray tubes displayed returning echoes as vertical spikes. Operators measured the height of the spike against a calibrated scale to determine range, whilst a second tube indicated bearing. By 1937, the system could detect aircraft at 90 miles and estimate altitude through signal strength comparison. The chain home network grew along Britain's eastern and southern coasts, 20 stations operational by September 1938, covering approaches from Norway to Portsmouth. Each station required its own power supply, operations room, and crew of specialist operators, predominantly women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, who proved remarkably adept at interpreting the ghostly traces on their screens. Production of the transmitter and receiver equipment occurred at multiple facilities, with valve manufacture alone requiring coordination between several contractors. Exact production numbers remain classified, but by 1940 the network incorporated over 30 main stations, plus additional chain-home low installations designed to detect aircraft flying beneath the original system's coverage. The towers themselves, massive steel lattice structures, were fabricated in sections and erected by specialist engineering crews working against impossible deadlines. Each main station represented an investment of roughly £60,000 in 1939 currency, a staggering sum that the Treasury reluctantly authorised only because the alternative was unthinkable. The system's first operational test came not in war, but in the Munich crisis of September 1938, when stations tracked aircraft movements and demonstrated they could provide fighter command with tactical warning. When war actually arrived on the 3rd of September 1939, the chain home network formed Britain's electronic tripwire. Operators plotted incoming raids, calculated vectors, and telephoned coordinates to Fighter Command's filter room at Bentley Priory. From there, information flowed to sector stations, which scrambled fighters to intercept. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe would only become apparent in 1940. German bomber crews discovered that British fighters appeared with uncanny precision, climbing to intercept at the most advantageous angles. The RAF wasn't simply lucky, it was informed. Raids that should have achieved surprise found Hurricanes and Spitfires already airborne and positioned. The Germans never fully grasped how thoroughly they'd been compromised until later analysis revealed the extent of Britain's radar coverage. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. There's more to explore about how this technology evolved, and your support keeps these deep dives coming. German radar development followed a different trajectory entirely. The Freya early warning system, operational by 1938, used a rotating aerial and could detect aircraft at roughly 120 kilometers, comparable range to chain home, but with superior bearing accuracy. The Würzburg system, introduced in 1940, provided precise tracking for flak batteries and achieved remarkable accuracy. Yet Germany never built a comprehensive early warning network around its borders. The Luftwaffe concentrated on tactical applications, gun-laying radars and airborne intercept systems, rather than strategic air defence. This reflected doctrine. Germany planned to fight offensive wars where early warning of enemy raids seemed less critical than precision guidance for its own forces. Britain's circumstances demanded different priorities. The Americans, meanwhile, developed the SCR-270 mobile radar system, one of which famously detected the Japanese raid on Pearl Harbor 53 minutes before the attack, a warning that went tragically unheeded. American radar technology eventually surpassed British developments in some applications, particularly in miniaturization and microwave frequencies. But in 1940, the chain home network represented the most sophisticated operational radar defense system in existence. The British advantage wasn't merely technical, but organisational. The integration of radar detection with fighter control created a system where information translated directly into defensive action. The Germans built excellent radars but never achieved the same level of systematic integration until far too late. The actual impact of British radar on the war's outcome resists simple quantification, though certain facts are beyond dispute. During the Battle of Britain, Fighter Command flew 56,000 sorties between July and October 1940, whilst the Luftwaffe flew approximately 46,000. Without radar, the RAF would have required continuous standing patrols to achieve equivalent coverage, an impossible drain on pilots and aircraft. Air Chief Marshal Dowding later stated that victory would have been impossible without the early warning system, and whilst such counterfactuals remain speculative, the mathematics support his assessment. Radar allowed Fighter Command to concentrate force at critical points rather than dispersing across the entire defensive zone. It magnified British strength by providing time to scramble, time to climb to altitude, time to position for advantageous attack. The psychological effect on both sides proved equally significant. RAF pilots gained confidence from knowing they weren't simply flying blind patrols, but responding to concrete information. German aircrews grew increasingly frustrated as their attacks met prepared resistance. Some Luftwaffe intelligence officers suspected the British possessed advanced detection equipment, but the theory competed with alternative explanations, including spy networks and sound detection. The full extent of British radar capability remained uncertain to German planners throughout 1940, partly because the chain-home towers themselves, though enormous, were dismissed by some as radio broadcasting equipment. The technology's influence extended well beyond the Battle of Britain. Radar-equipped night fighters using airborne intercept sets decimated German bomber streams during the Blitz. Coastal radar stations detected E-boats and provided early warning of cross-channel raids. H-2S bombing radar allowed RAF Bomber Command to navigate and identify targets through cloud cover. Radar-directed anti-aircraft fire improved hit probabilities substantially. Post-war, the technology revolutionized civil aviation, weather forecasting, and eventually found applications from speed cameras to microwave ovens. Several original chain-home towers survived into the 21st century, though most were demolished in the decades after the war. A preserved operations room exists at RAF Bentley Priory, now a museum, where visitors can see the plotting tables where young women moved counters representing raids detected by those invisible radio echoes. February 26, 1935. Daventry, Northamptonshire. A blip on a cathode ray screen. In 4 years, that blip would multiply into a network of electronic sentinels standing watch along Britain's coasts, their radio pulses sweeping the sky every few seconds, their echoes painting pictures of approaching danger. The towers rose like steel cathedrals to a new gospel. Information itself could be weaponized. Not the radio waves, those couldn't harm anyone, but the knowledge they provided, the seconds and minutes they purchased, the ability they granted to see beyond the horizon and through the clouds. Britain didn't win the Battle of Britain because of radar alone. It won because of pilots and Spitfires and Hurricanes and determination and luck. But radar gave those pilots the one thing they desperately needed: time. Time to reach altitude, time to position for attack, time to intercept before the bombers reached their targets. In a battle measured in minutes and seconds, where fuel and ammunition were finite and exhaustion infinite, that time meant everything. The Germans built faster aircraft and more of them. They developed tactical radars of remarkable sophistication. They possessed experienced crews and sound doctrine. But they sent those aircraft against an enemy who could see them coming, who knew their numbers and bearing and altitude before they crossed the coast, who met them not through fortune, but through mathematics. The invisible had become visible. The undetectable had become tracked. And in the summer of 1940, when Britain stood alone and the outcome balanced on the edge of catastrophe, that margin, that thin electronic margin between warning and surprise, proved just barely enough.